Hello and welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us as part of this, what we're calling a showcase for ministries or ministry projects that support the rights of Indigenous peoples. And of course, we are situating this event in the larger context of a conference that is happening at the United Nations headquarters right now, which is the annual proceedings of the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. And right now, this is the 21st time that that forum has met. And so we're here today to commemorate that and to be a part of it by sharing some of the ways in which we, as a community of Catholic women and men religious and their partners and collaborators in mission, have been involved in supporting the work that is behind this annual forum, which is the work of supporting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so to get us started for today, because we come together as a faith-based group in this context, we will begin with a message that came from one of the speakers that has the most light and the most attention when it comes to speaking for the Catholic community. And that, of course, is Pope Francis, who has been very vocal in the last several years about a need for transformation in the relationship between the Catholic Church in particular and people of faith at large with Indigenous communities, especially those who are present in the very rich ecosystem of the Amazon. And you may have heard in the most recent days that actually those statements from Pope Francis have reached the point of a long-awaited, a long yearned for apology to Indigenous peoples on behalf of the Catholic Church for many historic injuries and rights violations committed by members of the church and by people acting on behalf of the church in ways that continue to affect the ability of Indigenous people to enjoy their own rights and freedoms. And so we're happy to see that ongoing progress in improving relationships and reaching a more correct, more right relationship between people of the Catholic faith and Indigenous communities around the world. And with that in mind, we'll begin today with a brief video that highlights some of the hopes and dreams coming from the Catholic Church for the peoples of the Amazon.
The customer
And while that letter of love and that call to action was addressed specifically to the peoples of the Amazon, of course, the umbrella, the family of Indigenous peoples extends to all regions of the world, and where some places they might go by the name Indigenous. In other places, they may be recognized as pastoral peoples. In other places, they may be known as tribal peoples. But all of their rights, their gifts, their leadership is honored and brought to the forefront through the forum that's happening at the United Nations now. And so we also seek to bring all of those experiences in their diversity today. And so we will begin in our exchange and our sharing of ministry projects by offering a bit of information about how it is that we work to support the rights of Indigenous peoples in the UN system as a community of non-governmental organizations that represent Catholic religious congregations at UN headquarters. And so to offer that explanation, we have a few words from Daniel LeBlanc, who is the UN representative for the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and has been so for over a decade, maybe closer to 2 at this point, and who is a person very dedicated to supporting a group called the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that committee is not strictly a faith-based group. It's a collaborative entity that involves faith-based organizations, secular organizations, and some representatives of Indigenous communities, especially those who are present in this region of the world known as New York. And so we have a few words from Daniel now to speak about the work that he is involved in on behalf of his congregation through this committee.
Okay, the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We can move ahead. Again, thank you. We meet on the 3rd Thursday of every month, except the months of July and August, and we meet from 1 to 3 in the afternoon. For now, we are meeting online for the same reason as most other people are. So our committee and mission, it includes Indigenous peoples, representative organizations and institutions, international movements, government organizations, that is non-governmental organizations, and community-based organizations as well. We're seeking to promote the 1993 United Nations International Year of the World's Indigenous People. At least that was the beginning. on December 8th, 1994, the United Nations General Assembly launched the International Decade, and the committee transferred its mandate from the International Year to support the International Decade from 1995 to 2004. And we can move to the next. So following the close of the second International Decade, there were two, one after the other. The second from 2005 to 2014, the committee again transferred its mandate and changed its name to the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Our current mission is to support activities related to Indigenous peoples at the United Nations, to promote the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the work of the three Indigenous focused mechanisms: the Permanent Forum, which we mentioned earlier, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Okay. These, the subcommittees vary according to the times and needs. I freely admit that I was not there for the initiation of this NGO committee, but I have been there and mostly part of the executive committee since 2004. Currently, we have a subcommittee studying and working on traditional Indigenous medicines and on mental health issues, which is doing very interesting work. Why have I put so much time and effort into this particular group? Because I had the privilege of working with Indigenous peoples in Canada and the US, in Peru, as well as in much of Central and South America, especially in the Amazon region for a number of years. The rights of Indigenous peoples are very important to me, as they are often the left behind and those living in poverty. And because I have so much to learn from their traditions, their culture, their faith, their care of creation. And I have had the opportunity to learn a couple of Indigenous languages and work with the people in their own language. And basically because they are such wonderful, loving people, it's so much fun to work with them. Thank you to everyone.
So with that kind of international work as our starting place, I will add also that the current work of that group has included, at the present moment, they have just been hosting a delegation of representatives who have come from representing different communities in the Amazonian region to come physically to participate in this current forum happening at UN headquarters in New York. So the group has recently welcomed a group of about a half dozen delegates from the Amazon to come represent their Indigenous communities, to have meetings with government representatives, and to participate as much as possible in the proceedings of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So in addition to advocating on a regular basis through the mechanisms that Daniel mentioned, one of the greatest forms of advocacy that group can facilitate is offering pathways and invitations and opportunities for Indigenous people to take advantage of these same pathways for advocacy that ought to be readily available to them, but are frequently difficult to access due to expense or difficulties acquiring visas to enter the United States, or not having adequate accommodations once they reach New York. So these are the sorts of advocacy that we're able to offer from our position here at UN headquarters. And I'd like to go next to hear from another person very familiar with UN headquarters, but who I believe will be speaking mostly about her work in another part of the world, and that is Sheila Smith. So Sheila, would you like to share with us?
Sure, thank you, Teresa. I'm going to share my screen. And what I'd like to share with all of you is how my work with Indigenous peoples has transformed not just my life, or not just my work, but my life work. And I use that phrase because that's something I learned from one of the Indigenous grandmothers that I have the privilege of working with on an ongoing basis. And she helped me to understand how, in an Indigenous perspective, that they don't compartmentalize life the way I was brought up to do, that there's, work and school and recreation, and you look after all these parts of yourself. But their view is much more integrated, and that they look after all those parts of themselves, but that each one of those parts is your life work. It is my life work to have fun, to recreate. It is part of my life work to be the UN representative at the United Nations, as much as it is part of my life work to do every other aspect of living that I do. So life work is one of the transformations that I have, or a transformation of a term, a transformation of a worldview that is still working its way into my consciousness. So I've prepared this little slideshow for you, and my hope is that it might open up some conversation. First, I'll share something about the influence of Indigenous peoples on my life work. I'd like to share something about truth and reconciliation in the Canadian context, and then the work of Sacred Heart at the UN that has been connected with Indigenous peoples. So the first thing that I would like to do, I'm going to skip these two slides, is just situate myself. If you can see, there are 3 red X's on this map. This is a map of Canada, but with the names of the Indigenous groups that are in Canada, and with the Indigenous spelling of those names, and many of which I would not even want to try to pronounce. But I show you this slide to show how populated Canada was before Europeans came, how populated Canada was by Indigenous peoples, many peoples, and there remain many groups of peoples Indigenous peoples in Canada. And in Canada, there are three major groups of Indigenous peoples. We have what we call the First Nations, which make up most of these groups that you see on this map. We have Inuit people who are up in the north. If you can see my arrow up here in this kind of up in these areas up here. And then we have another group of Indigenous people called Métis. And the word Métis sometimes gets confused, that people think that because they're intermarried, maybe with an Indigenous person, that they are Métis. But Métis in the Canadian context actually means a specific group of Indigenous people who did intermarry with especially the French or the Scottish, and actually formed another culture with its own language and social systems. So those are the three groupings of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I put those three X's in place. This one on the right, if you can see my arrow, this is where the area of the country where I was born. This is where the Algonquin and the Haudenosaunee people kind of share this area of territory. And then my life work in religious life took me all the way to the west of Canada in these two areas. When I grew up, I had no education about Indigenous peoples. I did not know that they existed in my own country. I went to high school. There was one Indigenous girl in my class. And until I was in high school, that was my experience of Indigenous people. Later in life, I found out that this area at the right, bottom right of the map, where I grew up, was actually unceded Algonquin territory, which means that there was never a war, there was never a treaty for this land. So Canada continues to kind of squat on this territory of Indigenous peoples. There is a treaty in process now between the Canadian government and the Algonquin people. But this is true for many areas in Canada, that there are some areas where there are treaties and some areas where there are not. So it's still a very complex situation between Indigenous peoples and Canadians who are mainly from European descent, although that is changing dramatically. So that's a little bit of the context of Indigenous peoples in Canada and where I was born and brought up. So my first work, as I pointed out in that map, to the west in Canada, as a young religious, I was involved in teaching in an Indigenous-run school. It would have started off as a school, a day school run by a religious congregation. But by the time I came along, the school was actually run by the tribe of Native people with whom I lived. So I was employed by them. I worked mainly with children. I also worked in various pastoral ministries, visiting the sick, the elders, and helping out with liturgies. My time living with Indigenous peoples, I call my living there was like the best of the best and the worst of the worst. It was beautiful. The place where I lived, beautiful, beautiful place, beautiful people. But it was my first real immersion into the education of how oppressed Indigenous people are in my own country, how disadvantaged the systems leave them. So it was a real hard lesson to see what my own people have done in the relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada. So here's another, this is the beauty of the land that they care for. And on the right is a picture of myself in front of a fish camp in the summer. People move down to the river and fish for salmon. And anybody can come down. I would go down with a big green garbage bag and they would fill it up with salmon, and we'd be able to cut it up and keep it in our freezer. So here I'm just starting a fire in front of one of the fish camps. What I learned about church from living with Indigenous peoples is, again, in the same sense as life work. Church is about all life. Church is earth. Earth looks after us. Earth is our mother. Earth is provides everything for us. So in many ways, church is earth. Community is earth. All of creation is our community and looking after us. So as I mentioned before, this was a hard lesson to learn, but a necessary one for myself and for all Canadians to understand the relationship, the historical relationship and the ongoing relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada and what I could call mainstream society, those who have the power. So in 2008 until 2015, Canada went through a truth and reconciliation process. This process was initiated by the survivors of residential schools. And here is a photo of some students in a residential school in Canada with a sister as the teacher in the class. The residential school system in Canada was initiated by the government to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Canadian culture, and the schools were run by the churches. And I think it was 60% of the schools, it could be a little higher, were run by the Catholic Church. There were other churches involved as well, but the Catholic Church ran most of the schools, so cooperated with the government in the assimilation of Indigenous peoples into Canada. And that was done by taking children from their homes, bringing them to boarding schools, and basically teaching them a European-based curriculum. And they were in a situation where they were taken from their families and could not speak their languages. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was initiated by these survivors, because you've probably heard about all the graves that have been found in Canada of children who died in these schools. So the survivors of these schools initiated this process. The process, that part ended in 2015, and we are now in the stage in Canada of trying to live the calls of the commission. There are 94 calls that we are trying to implement to make a better relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. So it just happens that I left my work in Indigenous communities where I lived for 10 years and did some academic work. So after my education of seeing what was happening in this relationship, I decided to do some work, academic work, on Indigenous settler relations. And this photo was taken in India at a conference, it was called Women's Worlds Conference, I think. So it was all women presenting at this conference on any academic discipline. And The five of us who are standing here, we all came from Canada. I'm the only non-Indigenous woman in this circle, and we presented on women's empowerment in Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives in Canada. This work, if you notice in this picture, I am standing beside the woman in the long blue dress. She's a grandmother, Grandmother Isabel. Some of you may have met her because she did come to the UN. And I think I have a picture later. But she and I, even though we come from same geographical area, we met in India. And it was in India that we started to talk about the problem of human trafficking in Indigenous communities. I was already involved in the work of anti-human trafficking within the Canadian context in the city where I lived and was doing my doctoral work. And so Grandmother Isabel said, we need to do that work in our community. So she and I initiated a project, which I was in a role of support, and she gathered grandmothers, and they continue to work together as a grandmother's council. So this is part of the Grandmothers Council. In the picture on the left, I'm being offered to take care of the Grandmothers Council talking stick, which I still have. I was asked to bring that to the UN so that their voice would always be present there. I was adopted into this circle of grandmothers, and you can see the skirts in the right picture. All of us have the same skirt with red feather woman on the design on the skirt. So as part of the reconciliation process, one of the calls to action is on education. If you remember the picture of the residential school children and the nun, the sister, a lot of our problems in Canada between Indigenous and settler peoples, those who settled in Canada and their descendants, we still call ourselves settlers. The problem started through education. And so it is through education that we hope to find our way back. And I'm going to play a short video by one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who is an Indigenous man. He is a senator in our federal government and the first Indigenous judge in Canada. Oh, I think my sharing is paused. Just a sec now. Am I okay for time, Teresa? This is like 3 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. Don't forget to share the audio when you start too.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello everybody, I'm Murray Sinclair. I'm the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the issue of reconciliation, something which of course is very important to us here at the Commission, but also is of interest and importance to a lot of people in Canada. One of the things that we at the Commission have discovered is that it took us a long time to get to this point in terms of the relationship between Aboriginal people in this country. 7 generations of children went through the residential schools, And each of those children who were educated were told that their lives were not as good as the lives of the non-Aboriginal people of this country. They were told that their languages, their cultures were irrelevant. They were told that their people and their ancestors were heathens and pagans and uncivilized and needed to give up that way of life to come to a different way of living. At the same time that that was going on, non-Aboriginal children in the non-Aboriginal school systems of this country were also being told the same thing about Aboriginal people. So as a result, many generations of children, including you and your parents, have been raised to think about things in a different way, in the wrong way, in a way that is negative when it comes to Aboriginal people. And we need to change that. It was the educational system that has contributed to this problem in this country. And it's the educational system, we believe, that's going to help us to get away from this. We need to look at the way that we educate children. We need to look at the way that we educate ourselves. We need to look at what it is that our textbooks say about Aboriginal people. We need to look at what it is that Aboriginal people themselves are allowed to say within the educational system about their own histories. In addition to that, we also believe that what's important when it comes to looking at the way that children are educated is to understand that because it took us so many generations to get to this point, it's going to take us at least a few generations to be able to say that we are making progress. We cannot look for quick and easy solutions because there are none. We need to be able to look at this from the perspective of where do we want to be in 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 generations from now when we talk about the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. And if we can agree on what that relationship needs to look like in the future, then what we need to think about is what can we do today that will contribute to that objective. Reconciliation will be about ensuring that everything that we do today is aimed at that high standard of restoring that balance to that relationship.
So just to finish up, these are the grandmothers that I continue to work with. And if I can change the slide. So religious congregations have been working with Indigenous peoples since way, long before the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples happened. And religious congregations, religious have contributed to the problems, and we have contributed to the solutions. And I think that that's the important part for us today, is to be contributing to solutions. And my big point is that the solutions have to be framed in a different framework than the colonial framework that we first started working, we used when we first started working with Indigenous peoples. So that means listening to Indigenous peoples, bringing their voices to the United Nations, and in engaging together in telling the whole story, telling our story, all parts of the story. And that's part of decolonizing the future. And in that light, this book cover on the left, there is an article in it that this book was just published. I just received it on the weekend, actually. And Professor Cindy Godet, grandmother Isabel Mewasagi, and myself co-authored an article in this book. And this is the name of the article. I can't pronounce the second word, so I'm not even going to try, but it's basically Grandmothers Taking Care, an Indigenous Grandmothers Initiative in response to sexual exploitation of young Aboriginal women. And this is our story that we have recorded in this book chapter, our story of working together and how Indigenous grandmothers have changed our way of working together from a colonial to an Indigenous framework. So that's what I kind of wanted to share with you, and hope that we could have a conversation around what is shifting about the way we as religious work with Indigenous peoples or other populations that have not benefited from global systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, for sharing that personal story of how working for the rights of Indigenous peoples has been woven into your own story and your own journey. And now I'd like to go to a very different region of the world to hear some sharing from Anita Cheria, who incidentally is the coordinator for the activities of the Justice Coalition of Religious in South India, but who is also wears many, many other hats and has been involved in many types of work, all in the name of human rights and environmental justice, which of course touch so many issues. And I think she's following just about all of them in some way or other. But so she'll be sharing with us some of the work that she has done in India with tribal communities. Anita?
Thank you, Teresa. That's a tall order to fulfill, but I'll just share my experiences here. So it helps a lot that we've had few presentations before, and all of which are so true even in India. You know, the essence, the values, the challenges are extremely similar to what Sheila mentioned and what was mentioned before that. My journey with Indigenous communities started as a student when I was doing my graduation, and I was studying economics, and we had a lot of debates and very good teachers, and we realized that a lot of statements that came about production, about profit, about property, somehow didn't kind of sync with the tribal communities and the stories we heard, traditional stories we heard. So I started going for some kind of exposure visits, which we had scope for in college, and was visiting Indigenous communities in South India. At that particular point in my life, I was studying in Delhi, which is very much in the northern part of our country. But I belonged to Kerala as a family, so I knew languages in the south, and so it kind of clicked. And my exposure there kind of reaffirmed or got me more interested in the issues of the tribal communities, because they seemed to be so much more ethical, so much more grounded. I was also fascinated by their life because it was so different from the city and the way we kind of manage things, the solutions to life, the continuity, the kind of harmony that was there. What Sheila, I think Sheila mentioned about not being compartmentalized, whereas, you know, the healer, the nurturer, the agriculturist, the honey collector were all sometimes the same woman. And she did it at different times, and it just seemed just the right thing to do at each time. You know, so, and the botanist was maybe an 8-year-old girl who knew a song which included 300 names of plants in the area. And you had botanists coming from universities being accompanied by people from the community, because only they could identify the plants or the medicinal plants or any other plants in the region much better. So there were these kind of dependencies of experts on so-called uncivilized communities for many things. But at the same time, that label of differences remained. And in many ways, interventions, I'm kind of trying to move a little fast because it's been so long. I'm talking about 88, 89, when I was just in my early 20s as a student. That's when I started. And the region that I visited in South India was in Karnataka, in the state of Karnataka, where I continue to stay. And the issues that they were dealing with as communities was largely to do with their land, their homeland, which was now being coming under an experiment for protection, environmental protection. I mean, the forest existed because the indigenous communities lived there, and they didn't allow it to be commercialized because of their sheer presence and their way of life. But because projects of this kind were coming, and there were experiments about how land needed to be re-tagged as core zone and buffer zones and protected areas of different degrees, the indigenous communities were under the risk of being displaced to protect the forests that they protected and lived in. So that was a kind of a contrast of language in a way, vocabulary being used in the way of the dominant institutions and by people in governance. Because if you would look at it from their point of view, it seemed very illogical that the place that we have preserved needs to be preserved in another way, whereas you haven't been able to preserve it any other way in any other place. But that didn't get heard. And the assertion over controlling the forest was the fights that they were doing at that time. So I would accompany them in trying to understand how indigenous communities dealt with conflict with the forest departments, with the wildlife protection forces of the government, and with the international attention for greening the country. The need for green cover and forest cover largely meant that forests which were not so controlled by institutions before were now being looked at as a possibility for full control, and that meant displacement of tribals. India also was going through a phase of, still continues to do, keep initiating large development projects, so-called development projects, which included mining, highways, dams, all of which also meant it was the forest areas that were tapped for these things. And most often, even though we have laws on environment protection, on indigenous communities, we have constitutional laws protecting them, the power equations are such that it's very difficult for communities to hold on for too long. And the kind of negotiation which goes on is also in a different language. So one thing I understood very early was the way words are being used, even if they use it in the same language, meant very different things. So when small things like this might be interesting, because like the word used for home, say in a community in Bihar, the word that was equivalent in English would be a piece under the sky, under the trees, is what it translated to. But when the government said, we need to rehabilitate you, what they meant was a concrete block which was 10 feet by 10 feet. And they said, we are giving you a home. So when you had conversations where the vocabulary is totally different, or post-tsunami in the Nicobar Islands, I remember a very emotional discussion when a social worker from the government came and said, we have so many funds for the orphans, and you need to put up a project for that. And so many elders have died in the islands. And the people just started crying because they don't have a word equivalent to orphans in their community, in their language. They don't have the concept of orphans at all. So it's very, because for them, every child is precious, whether or not they're born in wedlock. The concept of marriage, the concept of care, the concept of family itself is very different. So a child referred to everybody in their parental generation as mother or father, depending on the gender of the person. They didn't have a different name for the birth mother. They didn't have a separate name for the father. Everybody was mother and father, and the child could actually choose if they wanted to stay with anybody, any adult they liked, or any family they liked. And So there were a lot of issues when it came to the negotiation with the government that the tribals would find it very difficult to kind of be cutthroat. Even the idea of property was alien to most tribal areas in India at that time. They usually thought of an idea of trusteeship. Like, this is something that we live on and we hand over to the next generation. They don't particularly own it. They might mark it in a particular way, but you didn't see footprints like a boundary wall or a fencing or a property paper in the community. There would be stories about how which part of the land was being used at each time. But these are places where we really fall very short when we go into intervene, because getting to understand this and just being there without actually intervening to respect and value their strengths rather than their weakness becomes a kind of a challenge that we are always facing. I have worked largely in support of campaigns and through NGOs working in the area, and at times through universities. So my role was mainly to support with documentation and being accompanying communities. The first presentation that came of the Indigenous Peoples Decade was exactly the time when a lot of these issues were burning issues in India. And I remember C.K. Janu from Kerala came for the first conference of the Indigenous people at the UN in 93, 94. And I was just remembering back that time when the presentation of the UN Decade of the Indigenous People came in. And that was a time when in India, especially in South India, we had about 10 to 15 years of NGO work going on in these indigenous areas. And the assertion there at that time was to find if the indigenous communities could take over, because the NGOs followed the government administrative boundaries when it came to organizing. Whereas when in India, when the indigenous communities got divided between states, sometimes they were divided into 3-4 states, a small group of indigenous communities that lived closely together went administratively separated. So in a lot of the assertion that communities did for land, it became extremely difficult for them to coordinate between each other and build on their strengths. So that these were the kind of challenges we faced in the initial phase. So a lot of documentation of their knowledge, their practices was one of my contributions at that time. Till from say 92 to 96, I was writing for them in a way that they could use their strengths and their experience to negotiate in a language the government would understand. So they spoke about the stories of how settlers came in, how plantations came into their area, how their villages shrunk over time, how the workers became agricultural labor instead of being farmers, and forming their own and even following their own agricultural techniques. There was a domination in many different ways. When it came to the government, it was about ownership and control. When it came to church and even other NGOs and basically elite civil society, whichever institution they belong to, even values of morality, of of the kind of rules we play on them, on what is right and what is wrong, or what is not good enough, what kind of clothes you can wear, what kind of language you can speak, what kind of socialization could be done, all seemed extremely fractured in terms of understanding. Because I think many a times we didn't have the humility to actually observe, understand, and actually go in the flow of what they were doing and why they were doing before trying to intervene and correct. So that was a challenge I think I saw many times, and myself falter and try to kind of step back and see things again. And many a times one technique we used was to kind of build a profile of the village with the practices that they were comfortable of by themselves. So even if there was an education program, one exercise we try to do is, maybe we did 5 alphabets today with women and another 5 with children, but we would try to ask them words that related to the games they played, to the medicines they ate for a particular disease, or the practice, or which kind of doctor would you go for each disease? Because so many things were different, and it was like fixing a jigsaw through a small program like an education program with children, and trying to understand the community before going in for, say, a policy change, or trying to decide what should be the negotiation, what should be the language that we speak. So these were small learning curves that happened. We unlearned, we learned, and moved on. And a few things that are now extremely difficult to deal with are the corporate and the government interests in indigenous land. Mining forces are extremely huge. They're displacing people. Even during COVID, there was no stop of mining in many areas. Displacement has continued in big ways because the cities have such a high consumption level that nothing is enough in terms of electricity, in terms of the raw material, in terms of dumping waste. So the way to alienate is not only to physically displace, but also to kind of put down your morale because you're not good enough, you're not civilized enough. And if you're displaced, you also lose your leadership, you also lose your ground. So you rarely have people from, say, church authorities or from government or from the politicians going to the villages to talk to people. They would prefer to bring 1 or 2 people into a very, very formal space, which would anyway alienate them and kind of make them ill at ease to do what they could negotiate. Maybe if one person came to the forest and was surrounded by 100 villagers and they negotiated together. So those are things that we try to learn along the way, that how do we increase the power of the community when they negotiate? Where can it be? How should it be? How much time does it require? How do you decide a seminar between, say, the indigenous community and people from representing any other institution? Because they have in most places, they have a method of consensus building, which is not about one-upmanship. So when a negotiation happens and somebody is trying to win over, and if you're alone, you just lose. So these are small things that I've learned over time. It's not as though it's perfect. It's learning all the time because there are different dynamics impacting indigenous communities. Right now, certainly displacement and homelessness is the biggest issue. Also trafficking of indigenous young children because they're so impoverished. There's no method to survive in many places after being displaced a couple of times. I largely work through partners who are already working there now. Over time, I have not now located with one particular community and working with that passion I had, say in the 90s when I was living with the community in Nagarhole Forest, and very much like Sheila said initially, everything was around them. So my work, my academics, my life, my livelihood, everything came as part of the community. But now I've moved out of the city. I work with different groups, but I continue to feel very passionate about issues related to the indigenous community, and they are having a very bad time still. So I feel the focus and the learnings from each other would be extremely valuable. I could just go on and on, Teresa, so I think I will stop so that there can be some time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And the depth of your experience is so clear from the variety of insights that you've gathered together from so many different causes and concerns. So we thank you for that very concise, very summarized synthesis of lessons that you've worked so hard to learn. And next, I would like to invite the sharing of an experience from Father Alvaro Tamble, who is a priest from the Congregation of the Mission, who is also a member of the indigenous people, the Diaguitas, which is in the region that we would know as Chile. So Father Alvaro, please share with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hablaré en español.
I'm going to speak in Spanish. I would like to explain today that I work with original peoples, not just from the perspective from outside, but as an insider. I am at the same time very at
mi país estamos sufriendo o viviendo un debate muy grande, un debate público, porque estamos cambiando la
because we are changing our constitution. And there is a constitutional commission that is going to that is trying to put in writing the rights of the original peoples or indigenous peoples of Chile. And I was able to participate as an advisor. And there are some seats at the parliament, at this constitutional commission. Indigenous peoples have seats reserved there in order to consolidate the rights of the indigenous peoples, but not just that, not only the human rights, but also the right to their own lands, the right to their own customs, and the right to their self-determination, and the right to relate in their own way, and how they interrelate among themselves, and how they relate to the government, and also the environmental dynamics, because we know that environment defenders are on one hand very young, which is very significant because it's appealing to us and it's telling us that we are breaking our world. And then we have the indigenous peoples who are also defending the environment and who are the ancestral caretakers of the earth. And so in Chile, we are proposing government constitutional rules to defend the earth, and we are developing them together with the indigenous youth who are going to be the inheritors of the rights that we are writing at the moment. I was taking part in the first COP, for Latin America and the Caribbean, for the right to access to information, to environmental justice and citizenship. And the environmental rights is about protecting nature, but also protecting the indigenous peoples. And this is the first time that the real participation of indigenous peoples has been warranted. And I was working with the COICA organization, which is the coordination committee of all indigenous peoples of the Amazons. And it comprises indigenous peoples from Latin America and the Caribbean. And through that committee, they could go to this constitutional committee to express how they see the human rights policy and the environmental policy, because they are nowadays more in danger. 2 out of 5 environmentalists, indigenous environmentalists, die every day. 2 out of 5 indigenous environmentalists die every day. And we need to make this reality visible, not just in Latin America and in the Caribbean, but also in the different continents where they are working. I would like to share with you this experience of being able to cooperate with indigenous peoples. from the church as well, where we need to listen. We need to try and understand what they are feeling, because we are not their voice. It is true that we fight for them, that we support them, that we try to make their rights visible, that their problematic is visible. But it's not our right to speak in their place. They need to find a place for them. And we need to try and understand that as a church, we have acted in a very paternalistic way very often, because we know what they feel and we're going to speak for them. And it is not true. They are the only real interpreters of their own voice. And that's why we still need to work for the rights of indigenous peoples, for the environment, but we also need to try and understand what is their link with the earth, their link with their cosmovision, their link with a spirituality of ecology, and how they feel that the church can help them. Because in other occasions, we have seen in other testimonies that the church has also abused them and has abused their trust very often and has tried to hide their voices. And that's why I wanted to participate in this meeting, and I would like to invite you to join together and work in a more cohesive way, because of many church organizations that are working for the voice of the indigenous peoples and that participate in these international meetings that are so relevant and that have a great incidence in the advocacy of the indigenous people's rights, need to be more coordinated to have a bigger impact with indigenous peoples and with the church. We need to be present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Alvaro, for your insights and for all of the work that you are doing as well. We're very happy to meet you and to be connected and to know you're already connected and working with the office of your congregation, the Congregation of the Mission at the United Nations, who is, of course, a part of the Justice Coalition of Religious and a good friend and partner to everyone here today. So we look forward to continuing to create pathways and opportunities for Indigenous voices and perspectives to come directly into conversations that happen at the United Nations, and so that we as leaders and members of faith communities seek more and more not to speak on behalf of Indigenous people, but really to listen and learn and create and offer spaces for Indigenous peoples to speak from their own experience. So thank you very much. And now we have a few minutes more. If there is anyone else in the group today who would like to take maybe 2 minutes to share your own experience in ministry, or perhaps to respond or ask a question of one of the people who have already shared some of their experiences today, we have a little time for further sharing or for responses. And if you would like to speak, I ask you to either turn on your camera and raise your hand so that I can see you, or you can use the digital function of raising your hand by clicking on the reactions button with the smiling face at the bottom of your screen. And underneath that button, you'll see the option to raise hand. So either one of those will help me to see that you are interested in speaking. And again, you're invited either to share your own ministry experience or to offer a word in response or a question for someone who has already spoken today.
I have a question for Anita. Actually, I was thinking when you were speaking about language and how important that is, and how they were almost kind of tricked into thinking like their home could actually be what their concept of home was. And they were told, here, they get this concrete block. Do you think that the declaration does enough to include, the intricacies of language, or somehow to slow down the process? Because the consultation we are finding is not, I'm hearing, is not happening enough when groups come in and take over their land and projects get established. But so I'm wondering, is there any way that can help ensure that the process of real consultation is happening and real understanding of language? It seems like the process would have to be slowed down and should be slowed down. I was wondering what you thought about that.
I feel that the bridge, when it comes to understanding, if it's a lack of understanding, there is a scope to bridge the gap. But when the intention to understand is not there, then it becomes really difficult, because you have this facade of conversations that don't listen to each other, and then that goes on. So it's, I mean, initially the emphasis was, let's bring more evidence, let's bring more analysis, let's bring more articulation that speaks for the people. But without power, nothing works. So you need to be able to communicate power in holding on to your resources in some form or the other. It's difficult to be violent. That's not a solution. It doesn't sustain, and the forces you fight with are much more. But the mind games of how power can be used, how governance techniques can be used to ensure that this articulation is also clarified. And when we say, like, I'll give you an example of Nagarholi, where I stayed and was living there in the community. When I looked at the forests where they were trying to demarcate protected area, core zone area, where they didn't want communities to be, the line of marking the core zone was like a deep pit that ran through the forest. And if it ran through a community village, it would cut right through in the middle. If it had to go around a plantation, it would go along the boundary wall without cutting through it. Yeah, so that's how dominance expresses itself, because you don't care two hoots about a village that is getting split and their whole life becoming so disrupted, because the place that they live in is very small compared to the place that they use. So if you imagine like a circle of houses over 100 meters or 200 meters, the space where they lived in was very small, the physical structures that they lived in. But life was mostly outside that sheltered space. Shelter was also trees. Shelter was also forests, which included fruit trees, and a little shaded trees, which included small patches of grain that was kind of protected by. But if you define, when people came to take the measurement of homes, the clarity or the imagination to say that the home is all this, when we fence, this is the area where we kind of live as our day-to-day living, our footprints go up to here, and then when our movement between villages goes up to here. I mean, that was an articulation that was not ready at that time. And it's very rarely understood or negotiated. So the equivalent of the place where you sleep being called your home and fixed. And sometimes actually communities have some kind of a movement even between seasons. So those are just not acknowledged. So I think PAR is very important along with articulation to be able to negotiate. Without PAR, it doesn't work. And what has happened over time, administratively and otherwise, is that the indigenous communities have been splintered into smaller groups where assertion becomes extremely difficult as a community. So that's the challenge. I'm not saying that it's a dead end, but I'm saying these are the issues that come up. It's not just about the correct articulation, it's also backing it up with power and people and an intention to listen.
Thank you.
Right. Anita, I think you make very clear the point that we do a lot of arguing and negotiating over specific words in our UN documents, but at the end of the day, the goal isn't the words being right or checking a box, it's that the reality is right. And the reality includes so much more than the words. And so we have to always keep in mind the intention behind the words is really the heart of whether or not that document really means anything. Are there any other?
Just wanted to add one more point. What my experience was at that time, the project we were negotiating was something through the Global Environment Fund, all projects through the World Bank. So they have their own practices of informed consent, of having consultations with the local people. And we found that most of those documentations were forged, in the sense that the mention of informed consent, the mention of consultations in the true spirit could not be corroborated with the community, because the things that happened were very different from what was written. So one way to negotiate is to use the language of the institution you're negotiating with, because those are things that really work in negotiation to kind of prove that you haven't followed your own principles. So if it's the government, it is their law and policy. And if it's an international agency or whatever, it's useful to know the language of those we are fighting with and use their own language against to prove a point.
Thanks. Are there any other questions or comments anyone wanted to share today? Okay, then I will bring us to a close with another short video coming from this Amazonian Synod and this intention and call to action from Pope Francis, through which he speaks of his dreams for the Amazon, which I think we can think more broadly of as the dreams that we share for all Indigenous peoples and for the wonderful, rich ecosystems that their cultures and lives can teach us to care for in a more responsible, mutual way. And so we part ways today, tonight, with this intention, this shared desire for a world that recognizes and respects the rights of Indigenous peoples, that sees and understands the richness and the beauty of the land, the way that Indigenous peoples seek to teach the rest of us to do, and to enter into a relationship of greater mutuality and respect with all peoples and with our land. And may the projects that we've heard about today and all those that we didn't hear about today to support Indigenous people's rights, may they flourish and respect the advice and the guidance that we've heard among us in this gathering. Thank you all for being here. And for those still participating in the Forum on Indigenous Issues, I hope you have a very fruitful last few days in the forum. Thanks to all of you and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Teresa.
Oh, thank you all for sharing.
Thank you. Good night.
So good.
Teresa, gracias.
Thank you, Teresa.
Hola, Rosita.
Thank you. I'm going to participate more through the work that in the work that you're doing. I'm learning. I will try to be more active next time. Thank you. God bless you.
Beautiful. Bless you too. Thank you, Rosita. And thank you, Anna and Dahlia, for your work interpreting. We're very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you for being here. Nice to be with you, Anatolia.
Thank you.
Oh, hello. All my friends from the workshop in Chile. Hello, hello. Paula, Clementina, Daisy, right?
Hola, hola.
Hola.
Hello.
Great to see you. Goodbye, everyone. Adios.
Thank you all. Thanks, Teresa.
Adiós. Adiós.